Hi, hello. I want to say hi to you and hi to people abroad that apparently are looking and watching these on streaming. So hi, everyone, and thank you. I would like to start with a thanks. Thanks, Carlos. Thanks, everyone, for organizing this. It's fantastic, and it's an absolute pleasure. It's a pleasure, and at the same time, it's kind of an awareness of how heavy we've become through these lockdowns and processes of just being at home working, and how slow and how difficult it is to drag ourselves from one room to another, from one country to another, and how difficult it is. And this is not only a matter of weight of our bones, it is also a matter of speed, of speech. This is a situation I haven't been for a long while, and it might also drag in the way we speak, in the way we present, and in the way this times out. So I calculated this to be around 3/4 of an hour. It might take a little bit longer because of that, because of this situation of coming out from our little boxes at home and our little screens and becoming some things of flesh and bone. Going on with a thank you, I want to say that many of the things that I'm going to do today and I'm going to share with you today, I haven't done them alone. And I am, because I have the privilege to be here now, I'm taking that credit if I make any mistake. But this work has been done with people. So Julia and Cornelia have been publishing and fighting all the way through this, the whole creative process. I will share more with you this afternoon, all the discussions, all the limitations, all the processes, all the failures that are embedded in this process of research that looks more like a kitchen than like a lab. It's not a clean, sterile thing that you do like from the distance. It's more a kitchen that just gets dirty and you need to go on cleaning and checking. So I've done this with them too. And there's people at SHU, at Sheffield Hallam, that are now also covering my back. So thank you, Sarah. Thank you, James. Thank you, Hantian, for covering my back while I have the privilege of being here. So set this. Let me go back to the chase and to the story. I would like to talk about contested urban spaces today. Protests, festivals, and city walks. But all this is a title that embeds this idea of the uses of geolocalization in media and communication research. So how can we deal with those things as in our kind of field of study, and how do they combine with other stuff? And as Carlos mentioned earlier, I have been doing things related to space, related to territory for a while. But most of it, I've also been doing things about public sphere, and I'm still there in a way. I'm still there after 10 years. But at the same time, this has improved and become something a lot more digital, a lot more fancy, a lot more abstract, if you want, but also a lot more interesting. So here it goes. I would like to start also with a sort of a summary of what's going to happen now. Today, I want to share with you 4 main ideas. The first idea is it is really cool to study geodata and cities as communicative fields. So keep this in mind. Keep this in mind. It is really, really cool. It's fun, it's interesting, and it's stimulating, and it's of interest. There's a lot of people that show interest on this research and on the possibilities of combining these things. So keep this in mind, because there's a but. It is cool, but. And today, this talk is about the but. It's about the aspects that we need to take into account as the limitations for it, as the problems that come with it, as the unthoughts. And this starts by understanding that cities are places of inequality and conflict. We cannot think of cities in a very romantic, plain way. We need to know that they are diverse internally, and this diversity is not a fun diversity one. It's also based on conflict and on contested situations. The second thing I want to go with a but is geodata is imprecise, it's problematic, and is creepy. And it's very important to keep this in mind, because you've been talking about the ethics of data collection. Well, data about where you have been, is creepy and smelly. So keep this in mind. That's another but of doing this kind of research. And the third one, Public sphere, you say public sphere and you sound old immediately. And yes, public sphere is criticized and needs to be criticized. And by criticizing it, we need to develop and improve and look for its possibilities as a useful concept that it is. And it's useful because it opens possibilities for further discussion. It's not useful just because someone used it one day. It's useful because it lets us think more. And that's what theory does. So, for all these three buts, I will take it to the point where I'm actually doing that kind of research. So I'm going to share a little bit what kind of strategies we have used and how this model that I'm going to share with you a little bit and more in the afternoon. The afternoon will be more about the how-to, has helped bringing these issues I'm going to talk about today to practice. Okay, so think, this is a theoretically informed talk. It is an epistemological debate, if you want, as in the value of knowledge that we generate through that. So it might contain names and concepts, and at times it might feel far from traditional communication research, but still is. So just give me that. And if you get lost, just remember these three items. I'm going to talk about these three things no more. So, life in space. This is the part where I talk how cool it is to study geodata and cities as a communication research field, okay? So, life is a unique experience. Life is something we live once and we live it as intensely as possible. And this is still something that we learned, but by learning and doing it, what we do is also we take pictures of it. We take pictures of this uniqueness, we report on this uniqueness, we've become reporters of ourselves so that we live it twice or multiple times. While we live, we take notes. While we live, we report. These devices that we have in our pockets have tamed us into paying them attention every 5 minutes. We go to them, they call for our attention and we give it to them. These needy devices of us have helped us in a way to live twice, to record ourselves while living this unique life. And what we do when we have reported this, when we have recorded this, what we do is we share it. And we share a lot of things, and we share more than we should be sharing. And we talk about ourselves to people who really don't need to hear about ourselves. And we end up also exhibiting ourselves in platforms that are made for our own exhibition and our own self-amusement of how amazing our lives are. And other people are just navigating through those. I'm saying this because this is a little bit of the context in which it is so cool to still study those things, because when we share them, we're actually generating a huge amount of data that is out there, a very valuable in ways, and sometimes also accessible amount of data that's a form of digital footprint. And I'm very, very interested in this idea of digital footprint. And of course, the approach is a little bit different from the one that I had in the talk before about ethics. This approach to the digital footprint, let's pay a little bit of attention to this digital footprint, has these two sides. One is the digital part, the part in which everything becomes kind of ethereal and becomes numerized and becomes, in a way online and going places as something that's transportable and placeless. And the footprint that has the foot and the print that says that we've been here, that draws a path of where we've been, that says an anchor to where we were. And that is something I'm interested in, because that is where the space I'm looking for happens and connects with the other space I'm looking for. And all starts more or less with this guy, or almost a century before this guy. When this guy, Walter Benjamin, started to study the work of Baudelaire, and he was talking about the flaneur. And Baudelaire was talking about the romantic that it is, walking the cities, wandering without a purpose, just letting yourself navigate the streets, the written streets that are out there for you to just enjoy and to explore. That led to further discussions that's called psychogeography, among others, that involves the meaning of your unwandered and unplanned work, walks, where have you been, and how these places have led you to these other places, and so forth. And this is the very root and the very start of the research I'm trying to do in a way, because multiplied by time, multiplied by digital devices, multiplied by the access to GPS data through our phones, what has happened is that a subset of fields of research have started to appear. One of them is geomedia, with some strong foci of research in Europe and in other places. And locative media, that's also something that was a lot published about 10 years ago. And beyond that. And the other is the aspect of the geo-web, as in the web that connects us to the places and where we are. And this field is a little bit where this story starts, but it goes to this kind of artistic expressions as much as they were artistic, this first analysis of locative media. So there's this man, Anthony Hoyt, a Londoner that loves to ride his bike and use the GPS data to share his rides in a very strategic, intentional manner. Believe me, it has to be intentional, to show us the Novembre man that was once in London, and he used it as in after a ride of 72 miles around London to just draw this man with a mustache here, or this other Sheffield man, that's a Yorkshire man with a ride that started very, very close to Mersbrook Park and navigated the way for this man with a hat to show this thing. Well, that's an artistic expression, and it's very well connected to the kind of things I like to do, because actually you can apply this kind of possibilities that we all have to this, and organize a festival in the middle of July, in the middle of Sheffield, with music happening in multiple venues around the city, and have ethnographers being tracked themselves and connecting their paths and seeing where have they been over the festival time and what kind of routes did they decide to walk. And you can overlap this with tweets, for instance, that were generated during that time and see very, very clearly some patterns. Patterns such as, where does the festival happen? The main stage of the festival is at the top in that little park up there. That's the main stage. But as you see, there's a lot of activity in the city center showing that the city benefits from it, that the city also takes some of that. And basically those two streets are the nightlife of Sheffield and where food and drinks are there just to be taken for festival goers. So that's a place where people tweet from, a place where all the walkers have been, and so on. That's only an example of the kind of things that you can do when you start combining those stories. And so that's what I've been doing lately. I mixed advanced, some of them digital methods, research techniques to capture geographies and experiences through the data generated in, for instance, urban events. Okay? That's what I do. Now, it is really useful. It has a lot of strands of applied interest, and we can talk more about the possibilities of this afternoon. Because now we have to go through the but. It's a but. And there we are. Before going practical, I would like to share the theoretical background and the discussions that inform that practice-oriented and applied research. Let's go with the wise man in this case, Jesus Martin Barbero, when he dropped that epistemological warning. Now is the digital environment that becomes more accelerated and natural, because every time it is more part of our body, of our sensitivity, of our cognitive dimension, and at this point it becomes a challenge to think communication, starting by thinking it from the processes and the social practices that transform the transformations of which destabilize whatever we understood as subject or object of research. And this is a problem that we have, as in it destabilizes what we thought was communication. It's not about looking more what happens on the media, but how those media live among our complex lives and how they intertwine and mix with it in a very, very complicated manner. So there's the warning, we move on. I will discuss this epistemological problem following these three contested issues again. First, the city and the urban space as a place of inequality. Second, the geodata and its epistemological value as a place of uncertainty. And third, asking what happens with a government of that life space that's generated when we have a virtual life embedded in a physical life. And how do we discuss these things? I will finalize suggesting the model that helps orienting our analytical work to answer to this. So, contested urban spaces. This is the place where I talk about cities as places of inequality. Just to go on. That woman is also the woman we need to talk about, Saskia Sassen. Saskia Sassen is probably one of the persons that have more critically studied cities and their role in terms of power. And she wrote, has critically liberated the cities. She has approached the territories and explained how the geographies of power work as machineries of geographic exclusion. Space is a practice of power. It is not only the stage of power struggles, but power in itself. Because space exists in relation to power, not as an a prioristic objective condition. So space was not there, and we made of it whatever. Space is the power in itself. Space embodies the power. The distribution of the seeds in this particular space is an example of that. Only from these perspectives, the transgression inherent in occupying the squares starts to make sense. And this is an example. Here, Mr. Scolari wrote a long time ago, in 2003, a discussion, a very, very interesting discussion about how the city of Genoa at that time, the site for the G8 meeting, and with lots of conflicts associated with it, became a space that was somewhere between the playful chasing the flag game between Protestants and between protesters and between police and security forces and governmental institutions, and at the same time a place of conflict, a place of contested situation, because the city was designed to have these three zones: the red zone, the yellow zone, and the green zone. The green zone was accessible to everyone, the yellow zone only for some in and out, and the red zone only for those belonging to the G8 and the ones discussing. That was a design, and it was put in place at that point intentionally to make sure that security measures were in place. Well, that's not the only moment that has happened. I have a paper from 2016 with Cornelia about what happens in Vienna every year in January when the Academica Ball takes place. The Academica Ball is one of these balls that happen in Vienna with waltzes and so forth, but it's a very racist, extreme right-wing, worse than that, neo-Nazi teams and organizations go there and meet. And they have this ball, and the city goes angry with it. And what happens is that they need to block the city center, and they don't even let people wear hats and capes and so on. So there's a whole discussion there, and that's something we wrote in 2016, as in how the city is organized because of that kind of very deplorable events. So similar situation, also the city center and so on. But there's more. This is the city center of London. If you look at London, you can see also that because of this web, it shows you the capacity of acquisition of the people living in London. And you see the red ones are the rich people and the yellow ones are the not that rich people. And you can see exactly how this distribution is not an accidental distribution. People like to live next to the river. The river has become a place of luxus and pleasure. But there's another thing here in this map. You see the blue line. The blue line is the London City Marathon. The London City Marathon is a world event. It's a global advertising for the whole city. So where are people going to be let run? Where are people going to be let taken pictures of as while they're doing their athletic sports? Obviously, there's a clear preference of the red zones in this itinerary that goes connecting by the river and the different areas of that. There's no more London than that. Of course, there's more London. But there is a clear intention to promote a particular side of the city. And that particular side of the city was also already detected in 1845 by this man, Engels, when he went to Manchester and looked at the revolution, in the Industrial Revolution, and he visited Manchester and said, oh, this money aristocracy can take the shortest road through the middle of all the laboring districts to their places of business without ever seeing, I would say without ever having to see that they are in the midst of the grimy misery that lurks to the right and to the left. This idea that you can be a bourgeois and believe that your city is the most beautiful city in the world because you don't have to see the poverty that's outside your everyday roots because it's been designed for you not to be able to see it. That expression of 19th century combines very well with what I'm trying to say. The city is a space of diversity, but it's also a space of conflict. So, what happens when we go and take selfies? What happens when we go and take pictures? What happens when we go and share the visit of the weekend to the city with our peers? What happens then? What kind of city do we show? What we do is we multiply that space by the inequalities that are also provoked by our access to social media, by our access to devices, by our access to the Wi-Fi. And this is what people like Rob Kitchen write about these things. Rob Kitchen is the kind of people you need to keep in mind when you want to think about digital spaces and so forth, because he's a big guy in that field. Spatial media are transforming the production of space and the nature of spatiality itself. Therefore, concepts like the third space, emulating the work by Homi Bhabha, for instance, or hybrid space, as in Chadwick talking about journalism on Facebook, blah, 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 and communicative space or code space, DG Place, Geo, Web, Geomedia, Locative Media, Spatial Media, Mobile Media, Interfaces. Do you see what's happening? There is a lot of interest in that kind of phenomenon, if you want, but there is a very dispersed area of literature, dispersed areas of interest that focus on one or another aspect. And this is worth noting because it means that the field is hot, that there's stuff to be done there, and it's worth talking about it. It's never about being the only one and being the original one. It's all about knowing who else is doing what and how do you fit and how do you have a conversation with them. So here goes the story. Now, next. Contested geodata. This is the place where I talk about geodata as imprecise, problematic, and creepy. Sorry, I'm not going to talk about ethics too much, and sorry, I'm not going to talk about algorithms too much, because there's a lot of that, and please go and look for that. There's a lot of datification research on there. There's a lot of discussions about who owns that data and that kind of thing. I am very interested in that, promise. I completely acknowledge that, but I have only a certain amount of minutes, and I think it's necessary to take a step back there and say, what do we mean when we talk about data, geodata? What is that? Actually, if you look at it, all data ends up becoming a form of geodata, but not all geodata are equal. And when I say this, I mean that if you have a definition like this, Loriot, special data are understood as any data, quantitative or qualitative, which have a location, for instance, spatially referenced with coordinates or topology. If you put the name there, or if you put here, you're already connecting whatever you say to the place from where you're saying it. And that makes it into geolocative data, if you want. Okay? So, apologies for this. The most rudimentary reference to place can be considered geodata. I'm not going to talk about all those, but I'm going to focus particularly to this digital geodata that our phones collect as we are here even below layers and layers of house. In 2019, the Spanish government announced, chimpum, pampa, like how good are we? They announced this supermassive studio research about geolocative data. They said the National Institute of Statistics for Spain is going to collect data from Movistar, from Vodafone, and from Orange for a few days of the year 2019 and 2020 so that we can check the mobility of the population in the Spanish territory. And you go like, all right, I think this should have gone through Mariana before. we should have gone through some ethics committee before getting that process. It is a very problematic kind of research proposal. It involves the idea that this data existed before. It means that this data can be used again. It means that this data is interoperable so that you can, the data from Vodafone and the data from Telefonica are somehow compatible, and it means that you will be able to put use to them as in according to your particular interests of this time, not necessarily. Whoa. We can talk about the ethics implications for that later. Actually, it's one of the exercises for the workshop. I'm super happy to share with you, but only to drop the bomb of one of the conflictual issues that happen when you are very interested and seduced by the possibilities of that data, and B, you don't go through the ethics committee in a proper manner, okay? But the question I would like to tackle here is how reliable is the geodata in relation to what it means, the uses and the meaning that we give to it. And there's a bunch of big men and big names. Bruno Latour would say, well, data are not the phenomenon, and actually the data would end up becoming the silent witness, having more credibility than you. If data says that you have been in a particular place, you can start denying. Nobody's going to believe it because we believe the data. But there's a split there between the data, the non-human element, and ourselves. And we need to take into account this is a limitation of data. Data does not become, or is not exactly as the experience. But this has another shape too. Data is organized. It comes out as something that's millimetrically and metrically organized in a space that's mapped. And that mapped space that goes with the coordinates is not the space we live. We live in complex spaces that are trapped in social practices, that are trapped in social dynamics, that are a lot more messy, a lot more disorganized, a lot more ill-constructed and confused life space. And this is something Michel Foucault wrote under the form of heterotopia and a space of compensation between that organized world that we need to believe and the world we live. The next split here would be the difference between the being there and the having been there. And there's a beautiful sentence here that's crazy to read, but coincides with the idea of signature as designed or as defined by Derrida. Was it marks and retains the having been present in a past now, which will remain a future now, and therefore in a now in general, in the transcendental form of newness. Geodata, he means, remains when you are not there anymore. Basically, geodata says you have been here even if you are not here anymore. And that becomes a form of a certificate, of a signature. And it's a split between where you are and where you have been. And that where you have been through data hounds you, catches back, comes and pursues you. And that's one of the problems. And the fourth, does the moment of generation of data and the purpose of it coincide with the moment of recognition of data? Does the moment of the production of the data coincide, or how does it not coincide would be as in Eliseo Veron's model or Eliseo Veron's understanding of the production and recognition moments and the circulation in between. So data is not something that remains there forever. It's something that's different in the moment you generate it from the different you read it. And it cannot be understood as something that remains external to whatever of those processes of meaning provision or meaning generation. So, we fill that space between the having been and the not being anymore, between the experience and the data, between all those things. We fill it with culturally constructed ideas, with assumptions that we do not discuss, but also assumptions that we cannot capture. And these are the critical ones. These are the ones that are full of ideology. It's the mythologies by Roland Barthes, if you want. It's the full of ideology that's built in that socially constructed moment between what the data actually says and what the data actually means. And I want to keep this as one of the biggest limitations of that geodata, and any research that comes out of this needs to go through this filter of conditions of what it is. And finally, the contested public sphere. This is where I talk about public sphere, which is one of the spaces I love to talk about, but I'll be short. And public sphere is a criticized but a useful concept. There you go. Every time I talk about public sphere, this man appears. It's Jürgen Habermas, and we've been talking about him forever. And he, in a way, has ended up owning, and I would say it's kind of a difficult and discussable appropriation of the concept, because basically he wrote a book in 1955, but he could not publish it until 1962 because it was not that good, that book. But that man wrote that book, and actually he appropriated from a concept that was written by this woman a few years before, and this woman is Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt just kind of lost the credit in the process because she's been taken for other kind of thing. The concept was Öffentlichkeit, which is the German word for something that was translated in French as espace public, or in Spanish in 1981 as publicidad, which is the publicness of that space. The translation in English got us lost because it was public sphere. And from this idea of public sphere, we get lost into many problems that come afterwards. But what they mean in all this dance of concepts, they mean the conditions of possibility for the public discussion to take place. So how well sits the public discussion? Is it repressed? Is it partial? Is it only accessible by some? Is it something that is openly expressed? Is it something that is conditioned by who can and who cannot be in a particular place, in a particular moment? That kind of thing. And this is where also the criticisms have emerged. But also, beyond those criticisms, I would like to identify 4 or 5 aspects that come in the definition or the notion of public sphere, and that would be useful to remain. One is the idea of locations. When Habermas described the London of the 17th century or the 18th century early, as in the map of the picture they have behind, he talks about locations. He talks about pubs, he talks about coffee houses, and he can talk in this case, for instance, as a festival that happens on the ice of the river in London. On the ice of the river in London, yeah, just swallow these 3 words and think of the climate change for a minute. Ice on the river in London used to happen regularly, about 2 months a year. Set this, go on. Agents, Habermas talks about agents, about citizens. Most of his citizens he talks about are men, and they're Christian, and they're white, and they're bourgeois. Yes, we know. But still, agents, please keep the agent part. Let's incorporate women, let's incorporate migrants, let's incorporate all layers of population that at that point were not allowed to participate in the process, and let's think about it as an opportunity for us today. He talks about mediating platforms. He talks about the contents or the sites where the newspaper pages, the posters, the contents of the posters, the stories, or the devices, the paper, the platforms in which this happens, the images, the venues, and he talks about the topics and the issues that are being discussed. He talks about politics as being discussed. He talks about literature as being discussed. He talks about business as being discussed, as these men were all businessmen. But in that context, what are the topics that are being discussed? This is an area of the research on public sphere. And finally, the purpose. These people discussed because there was a purpose inherent in that discussion. And the purpose had to do with these 2 things. One is the ruling of themselves fairly, setting up rules for the club, for the community of us, rules that will be that will bound us all together under a same acceptable system of rules. And that was an idea. It can be as idealized as you want, but that was the purpose. And the second purpose is the acknowledgement of community. Because we belong, we discuss about our things together. And this is one of the principles that we need to think of when we transport this model further beyond and apply it to what happens in terms of digital spaces and so forth. Of course, this means dismissing the notion of the public sphere as a sphere, the volume of which that can be easily calculated with a mathematical formula. This is where the translation of the public sphere has led us to believe that the sphere was an idea that space is neutral, that space was there before we started discussing, that the space is homogeneous, continuous, flat, or spherical, as is the case. But the public space is a socially constructed, socially built space, and therefore it's unequal, and therefore it's conflictual, and therefore is contested. And then there's this woman. She points out that we need Chantal, sorry, that we need a broader notion of public sphere that goes beyond the institutionalized politics. That because defining politics in that narrow sense would miss the political dimension of the social. But we also need a notion of public sphere that incorporates the location and the extension of infrastructures that enable that activity. The public sphere, thus, must be understood as an inclusion of debates and spaces, devices and voices, access and contact as a complex, integrated circuit that considers them all as part of the process. So, closing. Governance of communicative spaces is the last aspect. This is how we have been dealing with all this. Just shortcut because the how-to comes again this afternoon. So we started with the notion of communicative spaces because the communicative spaces insisted on the idea of space. And communicative spaces is a concept that comes from, among others, Philip Schlesinger, and talks about democracy has to be grounded on a notion of open, accessible, communicative spaces that enable debate, negotiation, struggle, and disagreement. You see the proximity of the notion of public sphere from this kind of understanding. The second aspect we've been doing is incorporate the assemblage theory, as in the model developed through De Landa, or the theory developed by Manuel De Landa, but it is also inherited from what happens with the Deleuzian idea of assemblage theory that has been used, for instance, by Chadwick. Territorialization and coding are mechanisms of synthesis that refer to processes of stabilization, that's the community, and processes of legitimacy. That's the part of regulating ourselves or regulating that process. This idea matches well the notion of social community that negotiates its own regulatory processes, and the mobile-enabled interaction contribute to its stability or disstability eventually as community. And that's one of the things that allows us to incorporate these new dimensions of digital devices. The other aspect is the interface as a network of human and technological actors, that individuals, institutional actors that maintain relationships and evolve as a one process. The school, university, political parties are interfaces in crisis and must be redesigned. But here also, the notion of the public sphere allows a redesign in terms of operability, in terms of possibilities for us to use it as a concept that's still useful, that can integrate all those aspects that we've been mentioning without dismissing them, and instead deal with that complex ecosystem, and at the same time allow us to do what the public sphere is designed to do, or as a model to check to what extent, to assess to what extent that space is actually a participatory space or it is not. Okay, so this is what we've been calling the governance of communicative spaces, as the rules that set the conditions, the systems that set the conditions for that space of participation that goes online and offline, on the streets and on the platforms, as a space of interactions, a space of discussions, so a circuit across which communication flows, and the notion of a shared, open and accessible area that lies behind. So that's where the theoretical background of our applied research with the maps and the discussions and the itineraries I'm going to show you more about this afternoon has taken us. So, back to start, wrapping up here. I wanted to share 4 main ideas with you. First, it is really cool to study geodata and cities as communicative fields. It is a growing field with many options for development: place branding, cultural events, mobility studies, audiences. Come on, think further. It's very, very interesting what we can do with that. But, big but, is a research with epistemological pitfalls. We need to review its processes all along. And one of these is the cities. Cities are places of inequality and conflict, multiplied by mobile devices and online connections. These are multiplying factors, not factors that dismiss the inequalities that were there before. Second, geodata is imprecise, problematic, and creepy. And there are 4 splits that disconnect data from reality, and we need to be aware of that disconnection. Humanness of life, the mess of life, the permanency and the non-permanency of our living through that life, and the meaning lack that happens through that. And finally, the public sphere is a criticized concept, taken, but useful still, is necessary to keep all its features, material devices, location, infrastructures, not only the discourses, which has been one of the big problems of public sphere research, that has focused on what was said and not in under what conditions it was all said and explored. So, to bring these issues in practice, that's what we've done. We have incorporated the notions of assemblage and of interface. This afternoon, I will be delighted to tell you how. And if you want to read where I've been writing about all these things before, that's the stuff that you can take later home or something. I'm happy to share that presentation with you if you need to. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mon. Thank you for this great combination of big data and territory, social sciences, critical approach to big data, and critical approach to traditional concepts. We have about half an hour. I think it's not a problem if you want to ask questions in English, Spanish, Catalan, even in German. He speaks also German, Italian. So to facilitate the conversation, podeu parlar en català, no pasa res. ¿Preguntas? Yo voy llevando el micro. Yo tengo varias, pero no. Seguramente acá hay mucha gente haciendo tesis sobre temas de política, otra gente a lo mejor haciendo tesis sobre otros temas, pero seguramente esto del territorio del espacio o este tipo de approach, digamos, seguramente les será muy útil para las investigaciones. ¿Alguien quiere? Gabriela.
Just shoot.
Feliz de desvirtualizarte, primero. Feliz de eso.
Please.
You want me to go in English just?
It's absolutely fine. No worries.
I love the approach here because something that makes me always quite, I don't know, not mad, but at least it makes me nervous about academia is that people tend to be a specialist in the worst possible way, you know? So, yeah, I love that in order to think really beyond and find new spaces, you had amazing international and different timings references. That, I think, is embedded in really developing a really critical approach, and I enjoyed it very much. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So no question. Oh.
I think that's the only way. But no, I was amazed by the level that the complexity and the ability to put it all together in such a strong storytelling that makes sense, even for the ones who are not deeply into data and the details. It works. It's fantastic.
No, thank you.
Hi, I'm Saman. I would like to ask a question about a reference you made with regards to the Spanish government when it decided to take data from Vodafone. So is there a law in place now that they cannot do it anymore? And what happened? Like, I want to follow up with that. That was it like the consent was given, or now there are some rules to keep a check on that? Because in last few weeks, I attended a seminar about that where they also the Catalonian government officials, they were here and they were talking about the good usage of geodata. So I would like to say if there are still any laws in place to keep in check the government too about this mobility experience and the data that they can take from these networks.
There are two answers here, and I love it. Thank you. That's really good. There are two answers here. One is the answer that would put me in the place of a citizen, which is initially the place from where you are asking, right? Which is the place in which you ask, is there some regulation somewhere that protects me from those companies and that institution to use that data, eventually mine? The answer to that is that there are laws, but because in that case it was something implemented by the government and the article in El País. I actually have only seen that in article in El País and then some other references here and there, but there's very, very little information about the specifics of that. And I was very careful about talking about it in the sense that I wanted to know about it before criticizing it, and I haven't found it. I mean, I think if I was El País, I would have retired that. And it was just before pandemic. So things might have changed in the process. However, no, there is not enough law to discuss this kind of thing in the sense that the article insisted that all the GDPR regulations, the data protection regulations from the European Union that applied to all countries since 2018, that was taken into account because data was anonymized. And that's the refugee for that kind of stuff, right? It's data, it's anonymized, it's not individualized. That is, now comes the academic side of it. Now it's the limitations of the law. And as academics, we need to be the ones telling the law how it should go and how the limitations are happening. And you see people talking about datification precisely going in this direction and saying, no, it's not about privacy. It's not about my intimate parts. It's not about the volumes of my body being in the right place or not. It's about, or hairs or whatever. It's about the shared ecology of privacy as something that has to do with us all together. The feeling of being exposed and the feeling of being exhibited and the feeling of you being taken as, considered to be as, is something that data tends to lead us to because we identify data as little minor, single points, but it's an ecosystem that needs to be considered. So as academic, I would vote, I would push for, I would militate for this approach of law that is not happening. We have a law that protects ourselves, that protects us individuals, that protects us as our privacy through the GDPR, and the previous one that was the antecedent for it, that was the right to be forgotten, the internet regulation, but that's still not enough because it's very individual-centered, very citizen-centered. And instead, we should be moving towards another kind of approach to laws. There's people writing about this in Amsterdam and in the Netherlands. José van Dijk is writing a lot about this kind of approach. But there's more, and there's more on the regulation side that happens. And there's a lot of discussion also in Paris by a woman called... hang on. Francesca Musiani. She is an Italian living in Paris and writing in the CERN, and it's fantastic what she's, not in the CERN, yeah, the Centre for National Research, something. She's really good, and she talks about internet governance, and from there you get to that point, if that helps.
¿Preguntas? Antes de la conferencia estábamos tomando un café y Mon me estaba contando de cosas que tenía ganas de hacer de cara al futuro, trabajando con software de programación Python que se utiliza para gestionar datos, y hablaba de la posibilidad de aplicar eso a largometrajes, por ejemplo, porque ahora en su universidad están recibiendo un montón de material de archivo y la posibilidad de hacer estudios, por ejemplo, cromáticos, ahora te paso la palabra, muy en la línea de Lev Manovich y la analítica cultural o Cultural Analytics de Lev Manovich, que nosotros este año tuvimos una mesa redonda de discusión de su libro sobre estos temas, ¿no? Aplicación del Big Data a grandes masas de datos audiovisuales, fotográficos, base de datos de pintura. No sé si nos quieres contar algo o qué ideas tienes. Acá tenemos hay gente que está haciendo o que viene de un máster de comunicación audiovisual y cine y van a hacer sus tesis muy vinculadas al audiovisual. ¿Cómo se podría trabajar esta vinculación? Que ya hay trabajos, ¿no?
Sí.
¿Cómo te lo imaginas?
I'm going to answer in English, if is that right?
Should I repeat the question?
No, you don't. You shouldn't. Thank you. This is a fascinating opportunity too. I mean, the possibilities that we have with these little processors that do massive things, the computers we have in our pockets, our phones, are bigger than the ones that were necessary to go to the moon, right? And we take selfies with it. That kind of operational capacity that our computers have is something that we need to explore, exploit, and lose fear from doing. And in that sense, there are lots of aspects that require some creativity in the thinking and not as much in the doing, because doing it is not particularly complicated. The complicated part is the thinking. And I think coming to your point about metadata applied or data applied to or computing processing analysis that goes towards the cultural produce such as movies and such as films of sorts and so on. The possibilities there are amazing, and they're just very, very much a growing space. And one of these ideas was, okay, if you have a register, if you have an archive of many, many movies, and this is something that's happening already, Netflix is doing this, you can also analyze patterns of what happens in movies. You can analyze the movements of the camera electronically. It's not a difficult thing to do. You need to identify an object inside the screen and basically follow it. And by following backwards, you know if the camera has moved or not. Do you think it could be possible to analyze the style of a cinema maker, as in by the movements of cameras that they use? Well, actually, this is happening. It happens in Instagram when you get this connection with movies and say, like, okay, look, parallelisms between movies. Well, that's something that watched the movies and did it humanly. But this is a kind of thing that also, computer-assisted research could do and could help do. And this happens also with color patterns. And when you see the color patterns of a particular photogram and you go, oh, look, this person, Amélie uses this kind of patterns and I don't know, Blade Runner uses this other kind of patterns. Those are very easy scripts on computing processing. You only have the movie and it does it for you and you can just cut it. So could we identify styles of cinema, styles of authorship, even use that towards what has happened? And you were mentioning with paintings and styles and art. I remember I was studying my PhD and I remember having this conversation with Salvador Cardús, who was talking about the things that you barely detect. He's a sociologist, and we were talking about epistemology of knowledge and like science and so on. And it was that point. It says, well, how do you detect that a painting is fake? He says it's not on the quality of the picture itself. It's in the little details. And most of the times it's so little as the shape of the ears, because nobody pays attention to the shape of the ears, but the shape of the ears can reveal that this was not the person who did it, because that is the aspect that nobody pays attention to. And therefore the fake can be easily identified there and somewhere else. Well, could we help computers to do that kind of thing also about movies, find ideas of authorship, find ideas of, there's a dark side to that, right? And the dark side that comes immediately is what Google did with books and Google did with words. Google presented itself as this super mega galaxy, Gutenberg galaxy kind of project or beyond with Google Books, and what it did was basically colonize the words that had been published after a particular time. So they detect now that something has been published before. They detect now that there is plagiarism, something that in non-computer times would be just a reference. Now it becomes a prosecuted, regulated, anti-copyright, anti-creativity kind of operation that's computerized. And of course, that's the dark side of it. And I think it's up to us up to you, because you're in that wave now. It's up to you to be able to care and be creative and be systematic and be ethically aware of what are the dark sides and how to play in that delicate balance between what we do, what we can do, what we should do, what should not be as in a priority in our kind of line of research and so forth, and how do we transmit this further to people who might be listening to us in another moment.
Here in UPF, we have a traditional research line on the identification of visual motifs in cinema. And I think there are a couple of colleagues. I think Manel Garin is also working in this direction that you are talking about. The possibility of analyzing, of identifying visual motifs using digital tools. And I was also thinking, for example, for detecting intertextuality. For example, I don't know, the traditional movement, camera movement by Alfred Hitchcock, when he moves the camera and uses the zoom at the same time in Vertigo, has been used in many other movies. And you could analyze 100,000 of movies detecting who has used this specific camera movement.
And then you find The Simpsons, because The Simpsons have done everything.
Everything concludes in The Simpsons. That's for obviously. Any question, preguntas? Here.
Bueno, muchas gracias, realmente apasionante. Estoy empezando todavía, pero mi tesis sí que trata sobre las City Symphonies, el subgénero que nace a principios del siglo XX, y me pregunto si tienes alguna idea, o imaginas cómo deberían ser, después de todo esto y con todo esto, estas City Symphonies que deberían hoy poder estar también en el cine de alguna manera. Es una pregunta muy genérica, lo sé, pero es que hay muchas cosas.
Disculpa, ¿puedo hacer doble clic en City Symphonies y me explicas un poquito de qué hablas?
Las City Symphonies son un género de cine, un subgénero, dicen mucha gente, que empezó con Metrópolis y todas las películas de principios del siglo XX, cuando empieza a estallar la ciudad fascinante de la que todos los cineastas quedan prendidos. Entonces hay que buscar una rotura en el lenguaje fílmico para filmar y explicar esa fascinación que generaban las ciudades. Entonces es cuando el lenguaje fílmico se fractura, empiezan a aparecer diferentes voces, etcétera, etcétera. Es decir, que la necesidad de filmar la ciudad cambia la forma de filmar, ¿no? El lenguaje fílmico. Entonces, claro, hoy con todo lo que tenemos y con todo lo que estás contando, cómo eso puede reflejarse en una City Symphony del futuro, por ejemplo.
Fantástico. El emoticono. I'm going to answer in English again. City Symphonies, I love it. I love also this starting point as an eclosion of transformation of the cinema as a language, as in relation to, I spoke about poetry from the 18th century, as in Baudelaire, and I moved on to the 1930s, where I mean, if anybody, Walter Benjamin, being right in the middle of that thing, right? He was aware of the importance in terms of art, of how cinema was a relevant language that would embed art. He was looking back to the 19th century and even before and even around, when he talks about the Angelus of when he talks about history and so on, when he talks about all those languages, he looks back into the literature tradition, and then he comes back to this. And beyond that, it's like Roland Barthes talking, and I'm mentioning Roland Barthes because in Scolari's article from 2003, the one he talks about Genoa, you went a lot towards Roland Barthes talking about the city as a writing, and so I think there is a line there that connects all the arts. That's a PDF and it's online. The Scolari's article, and this idea of the arts talking the city and making the city is a line of research that obviously I wouldn't. There's something in me that would say, oh, this first idea of that genre of cinema broke cinema as a language itself. I would say like, whoa, let's look into that. It's interesting. Let's look into that. And that's perfect, because it's at your stage of your own research, developing that kind of question. It's perfect, because starting with a hypothesis that's what the shape has now, it might turn into something probably, likely more complex, more nuanced, more rich. But that same starting point makes it interesting. It's the trigger that makes me think. And I would look at this, at the parallels between the evolution of the city and the evolution of the expressive arts that happen in a particular moment. The city as an ecosystem for creativity, which is something that has been there, something that has been written about. The city connecting us backwards to the labyrinth of and the Minotaur, where there's a danger in every corner, but at the same time, it's the possibility of you getting lost in it. And further in time, you can take it really multiple directions. And I think it's a very beautiful start and a very interesting element of connection. So I wouldn't be very prudent at this point. I would just let it flow and let it go and let it grow. There will be a time where you will have to limit things and say, oh, I cannot do that. I will do this as my postdoc kind of work. But at this stage, just open. That's fantastic. Cool topic. I'll keep that in mind. It's very nice.
Nos menciona Manovich, una de sus investigaciones clásicas, escaneó 1 millón de páginas de mangas con japoneses y dejó que la misma máquina, el machine learning, las clasificara. Y aparecieron clasificaciones diferentes a las clasificaciones oficiales del manga, que tiene todo un sistema de género y subgénero muy... como que había diferencia entre géneros que gráficamente la máquina las ponía todas juntas y otras a lo mejor las separaba, ¿no? Claro, con la misma lógica uno podría decir, hay un cine de interior, hay un cine de exterior que puede ser urbano o extraurbano, pienso en el western, y seguramente cada uno de estos géneros tiene movimientos de cámara, duraciones de las tomas, la parte cromática es totalmente diferente. Entonces, si uno pudiera cargar una máquina que ya hay base de datos con miles de películas e incluso lanzando algo de machine learning que la misma máquina vaya clasificando, a lo mejor aparecen nuevos géneros. Eso es lo interesante del machine learning, ¿no? Que te muestra cosas que uno no esperaba encontrar a ese nivel, ¿no? U otras organizaciones del material textual que uno no había percibido, ¿no? Manovich le agrega a esto las visualizaciones, ¿no? Tipo estas mapas acá que el investigador o la investigadora puede ir moviendo, ¿no? Y ahí van apareciendo nuevas cosas. Pero bueno, es todo un campo muy nuevo esto. Una de las, requisitos es tener buenas bases de datos digitalizados. En Europa está Europeana, que es una base de datos pública de la Unión Europea, que, por ejemplo, Manovich la utilizó, se bajó 800 pinturas de Van Gogh y las utilizó para identificar patterns en la evolución de la pintura de Van Gogh. Pero bueno, yo creo que todo esto, tenemos las máquinas, tenemos el software para procesar todo esto, ¿no? Y que surjan cosas.
Nos faltan las mentes. ¿Dónde estarán?
Y son investigaciones que tienen un pie en lo cual y un pie en lo cuanti, porque todo el proceso interpretativo, esto de desafiar las viejas clasificaciones, es un ida y vuelta entre el cuanti y el cual, y lo que hablábamos la otra vez, ¿no? El mismo planteo de él, ¿no? De ciencias sociales más cualitativa y vincularlo con lo cuanti, ¿no? Yo creo que hay un diálogo y un desafío mutuo.
Questions? And not only, it's also the network analysis. Incorporate that. It's not quanti, it's not quali, it's both, and it's more. And it gives you opportunities for visualization, for understanding, for perception. Networks are very rich. Mathematicians have gone crazy designing and exploring and studying them and their capacities. We see communities in them. We see a lot of things in them. And it is very, very useful because it's about attributes combined among each other, so quali with quali, or it's quali with quanti, the bigger elements on a network, the users with more followers talking more or less on Twitter. That kind of combinations gives you the quanti-quali and lifts it to the next level, and that's the network analysis. So please keep an eye on that. It's also a tradition that comes from the 1930s, so it's not new at all. There was this sociologist who wanted to study friends, like networks of friends for voting and so on, and they started to draw little diagrams. And that was then taken by anthropologists and did the same thing. And then someone somewhere else just started doing some other diagrams to see, for instance, what kind of people did get what kind of job and what relationships did they get or did they have with the people that had that job before. I'll let you talk in a second. And you know, you could see networks of contacts for people to get jobs, and how those contacts had a particular set of patterns. So for job employment was a good reference to understand these things. And that was very much before social media platforms, before computer-based relationships. Now this has gone crazy, and it's a lot of software out there that I invite you to learn to use and to find ways to use and to YouTube a lot about it, because everything is there. Sorry, now you go.
Thank you, Ramon. I'm going to ask in Spanish, but please, you can answer in English if you prefer. Dos consideraciones y una pregunta. Me parece muy interesante la ligación que has hecho de tu trabajo de investigación con conceptos teóricos básicos, como era el tema del concepto de esfera pública, muy conflictivos, que a veces dan ganas de jubilarlos porque no sirven para comunicarnos, porque se han dicho tantas cosas y en tantas direcciones que no sabemos a qué nos referimos, pero como tantos otros, este es uno de ellos que continuamente nos seguimos refiriendo a él, porque claro, para jubilar a un concepto hay que saber dónde a poder hablar de eso, ¿no? Y es verdad que nos permite abrir un espacio para discutir según qué cosas que no sabemos cómo decir. Entonces me parece interesante el plantearlo como que está en continua crisis, pero al mismo tiempo tenemos que seguir recurriendo, si no en los papers, en la discusión, en pasillos entre académicos, se vuelve a recurrir al mismo concepto para poder entenderse, ¿no? Y para poder abrir espacio para hablar. Eso por un lado. Por otro lado, me parece muy interesante también la aproximación que has hecho a la privacidad, no entendida tanto a nivel individual, sino a nivel de privacidad del ecosistema de la ciudad, ¿no? De la ecología de la ciudad. Que yo creo que me gustaría, una pregunta que tengo es si a nivel legal, si tú conoces toda la regulación que se está haciendo sobre privacidad en la Unión Europea, solamente incluye el nivel individual o hay aproximaciones también legales para intentar hablar de privacidad pues eso, a este nivel más colectivo, ¿no? Que este ámbito a mí me pilla un poco más lejos. Y por último, has comentado a la hora de hablar del ejemplo creo que eran unos conciertos, ¿no? En Londres, de metodológicamente y epistemológicamente lo interesante que es cruzar los geodata, ¿no? La geolocalización con el análisis de discursos o de interacciones en redes sociales. No sé si podrías abundar más ahí en algún proyecto o en ese proyecto que os ha permitido cruzar esos datos. Gracias.
Thank you, gracias. I keep pushing the English because I hope, I am aware, that there's people at home that probably watching online. Okay, so that's why I'm just keeping them in the conversation so that they cannot go and have lunch or something. You know, why would they? They're so interesting. Now, so the answers here. Thank you for your comments. Yes, it's true. Public sphere is the hate-love kind of place I end up going and not want to go ever again, and once again you just fall into it, because, and that's why Habermas. I particularly have an issue with Habermas. It's kind of all right, you know. It's not my kind of favorite person, if you want, as in he's not allowing new scholars to discuss with him, and that's the kind of thing scholars are not nice to do. I just don't want them to do it, because actually when he grew as a scholar, he had the chance to talk with everybody. He wrote against Gadamer and discussed with him. He wrote and discussed with the Frankfurt School scholars. He wrote and discussed with Derrida. He wrote and discussed with everything. And now you have Sloterdijk and people who might be wanting to confront him for things, and he just denies that kind of space. And that's the kind of thing that just puts me a little bit off every time I talk about Habermas. But still, the notion of public sphere is interesting because it connects. It's basically the thing that put the media in the picture. And you had the political debates and the representation debates and the vote intentions and so on, but nobody was talking about the media having an agent role in that constellation. And that model did, and it did, and then it was misinterpreted for half a century, for 70 years now. But at the same time, the picture, and I insist on that picture of the London of the 1700s, when he speaks about that, he draws a network of pubs, locations, a network of publications, a network of debates, of people, doing all those things. And that is the beauty of it. We've missed that. We've understood public sphere as something that you do when you read the newspapers. Like, well, these guys did not only do that, they also discussed, they also went to the theater, they also made business in the meantime and drank beers. So, across that, there's more. But we've spent a lot of time discussing public sphere as what is being said in the newspapers, and that's boring, and that's old, and that's useless. Said this. Second thing, you mentioned the point of privacy and regulation. The European Union, the GDPR, is one of the most interesting media literacy phenomena that have happened ever, because it was implemented in 27 countries at the same time, the 25th of May 2018, the GDPR regulation. It was implemented at once, everywhere. Boom. It required teaching, training, learning, accommodating, all of it to happen at the same time, all over Europe. That's a huge effort of awareness. So the law is short, insufficient, individual-oriented. It has a lot of holes as a law. But as a media literacy phenomenon, it has made us all aware of it, whatever your role in life is, whatever your position in society is, and that is massive. Because for the first time, we're all aware that there's something that has to do with a law that you need to follow, and if you, allow me for the example, Carlos, if you leave the list of the students outside the door there, that could be considered a breach of data, as much as it could be with the telephone guides, right? Because it had everybody's name and address and number in them. How crazy were we, right? And now we know, and now that's a joke, and it's only 2 years away since that was implemented. Come on, big time, right? Next step, it is not sufficient. We need to work further. It is not sufficient because immediately the big corps have avoided it. They moved places, they moved styles, they solved this by a tick box here, boom, yes? Still not working. They still make money out of it. They still live out of that, making it in your favor. Now you have to tick more boxes when you do it, but that's the end of it. That's not sufficient. So no, there is not yet that approach, but yes, there is that thought. And yes, there is this role as academics that we take to kind of push towards that transformation. It will take a while. But this doesn't dismiss what we have as an opportunity. In many other countries, it's not there. The UK has been Brexited from it, which is one of my painful things, because I'm thinking, oh, Lord, do I need to let my children be seen by these big corporations in a way that in Europe would be absolutely illegal? You know, will they say my NHS, my National Health System data to some Palantir corporation that will use it for insurance companies? What if? You know, what if? Now, the third aspect was, does that help a little bit, right? Third aspect was, sorry? Oh, yes, what we did. Of course, what we did was we cannot live in a world that's virtual or physical. We avoided, and we made a huge effort to avoid that kind of a priorisms, and said, okay, we have a lot of data. How do we play with it? And how we combine it, and we found the paper from a guy in Sweden that wrote about the crossings between geography and communication, and found 4 areas of discussion. And he said, you can have representations, which is how we talk about space, which is not the space itself, it's how we talk about it. It's the representations of it. The second is the textures, how the space talks by itself and tells us, as in, is it a symbolic place? It's not the same a demonstration in the city center than a demonstration in the outskirts. So how does the space change the demonstration value, right? The third aspect was called structures, and it's how does the space channel that communication? Maybe it's the most sexy and powerful and life-changing conversation about how politics should be. But if it happens with a friend in a bar, that conversation doesn't go anywhere. Whereas if that conversation happened in the parliament, it would have some sort of impact, or if it happened on TV. So that's the channeling of those information. That's called the structures. I want to talk about this more in detail in the afternoon. And the fourth aspect is connections. Connections means how much does the space enable the possibilities of interactions. Is it a space that's open, or it's a space that's closed? It is a space that, it's a multiplying factor, basically. Is it a conversation that happens between two people in a closed room with no windows, or is there something that you can multiply by a window open and someone else kind of perceiving that? Or you can multiply by it being online, and so on. So these are multiplying factors that allow you the connections and saying, well, potentially this would have been a very big impactful conversation. So following these patterns, we've been writing chapters for each one of those, or chapters, or articles, journal articles for each one of those. So we have one about representations. That was the Vienna demonstrations for the ultra-conservatives. And we looked at the representations of the city, and we found that across the data, we found different representations, basically different cities happening at the same time. And it was the city of those going to the ball that was a conflictual city. Oh my God, I cannot walk the city kind of thing because, you know, I'm being harassed by the protesters. Or the protesters saying, I cannot walk my own city. I want my city back, and I want my children to have their city and their public spaces. And amongst, or in between those two, there was a third city that was the city of the police. And the city of the police was a city without anybody. That was the safest city. And the safest city is the city where nobody walks and nobody is there and nobody goes out. And that's what the police tried to do by blocking all the spaces and making sure that nobody was there. So with this kind of representations of the discourses of the city that you find on the data, you basically use the data by crossing what comes from one source or one another, and how do you combine them to understand the space again. Does that make sense? So not taking the Twitter data and the ethnographer's data as separate spaces, but saying, okay, what's kind of representations happens in one and in the other, and how can we build? Are they common narratives or are different narratives or so on? So the representation talks about that narratives of the city. There's another one about structures, which is how you limit the walks and the paths and the streets and so on. So that's the direction.
Okay, we have time for one more question because this man has to eat. We have the seminar in 1 hour and 50 minutes, 20 minutes. So the last question. If you have more questions, you can talk later in the workshop.
Hi.
It's not a question. It's more of a comment regarding when we were talking about GDPR and our privacy and people being anxious. So in terms of data analytics, they say if anything that is free or any application that is free, you are the product.
Mm-hmm.
So because when you are not paying for the product, the human on the other side is the product. So they are analyzing all of your actions when you download an application and it's free. So you give them the right to analyze everything about you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's the trick, right? It's like, and you tick the box and say, it's somewhere in between the terms and conditions. Would you mind if we tick the box yes or yes, and then you tick yes? That's the biggest lie of the internet, they say, right? So the terms and conditions that we apply for it. Yes, you're right. So that sort of, solves part of it. It's only part of it because there's still a premise on the GDPR regulation formulation that says that if you're not aware of it, if you're not aware of that use, or if you need to still confirm your permission. So it's not something that can be done at your back kind of to an extent. So GDPR takes care of that aspect, which is an interesting one. It's not only always an active decision that you do to stay off it. It's also the protection that abides you. But still, it's not sufficient because it's only about, then you can say, oh, it's all anonymized. It's all metadata. Metadata is the excuse for data not to be considered data, right? So it's still data. Thank you.
Very short.
That is an initiative by a lawyer, a Spanish lawyer and a Spanish designer, in order to make as the science of Creative Commons license, but for the rights of use and the privacy. So a sort of more visual and easily understood, in theory at least, way of not just clicking what we don't read. So consent commons. It's quite interesting.
Cool. Thank you.
Vale.
There's people elsewhere in the world that might be listening.
Sobre todo cuando haces un análisis como en el espacio, lo haces en función de la variable de clase. Por ejemplo, en estos eventos de lo que hablas era en Ginebra, sí. ¿No? Viena, eso. Se me ha ocurrido, por ejemplo, ¿hay alguien que esté investigando esto en función de, por ejemplo, la accesibilidad para personas con diversidad funcional? Porque al final un poco lo que se esconde detrás de este análisis en función de clase es como, vale, esta es la ciudad que existe, pero esta es la ciudad accesible para esta X tipo de persona. ¿Hay alguien que esté investigando eso desde perspectivas que vayan más allá de la clase y se centren en este otro tipo de cosas?
Sí, yes, two, three things. Yes, there is people doing mobility issues as in mobility capacity, as in mobility conditions. And yes, I shared what appears or what might appear for me to be kind of the most obvious conflictual differentiation within. It's not the only one we take into account, and it's not the only one we take for granted either, because it might take multiple shapes. So we look into for instance, on the discourses from one side, as in what kind of representations are, and sometimes, I mean, if you look only at the different representations of the city that happens between people walking and people driving, is crazy, the difference between them. But you change them roles and you put the people who are walking driving and you put the people driving walking, and the discourses repeat, whereas the people adopt the opposite side. So it's more a matter of where you are at the moment that you are. So if you organize a festival in your neighborhood, there's always neighbors that claim, what are you doing? That's my neighborhood, I want to sleep. Until, for instance, the organizers give them tickets, and then they're just not that angry. That is a kind of practice that has happened, just to justify that not only class, but class is kind of a visual aspect that brings to that kind of confrontation, but it's a matter of interest and positions. And about mobility, absolutely yes. There is a lot of research. I won't come with names now. I'm sorry, I don't. But there is a lot of research because among others, it has to do with sustainability in the city. It has to do with social diversity, and is one of the biggest priorities in the current research funders today, that we solve that problem of mobility within the cities and availability and accessibility and. So yes, there is a lot. And the accessibility has the multiple shapes as accessibility to online information, as well as accessibility to climb the stairs, right? I mean, just to understand that there are many forms of understanding accessibility, but it is also there, and the combination of both. So the answer is yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mon.
Oh, thank you for having me here.